There we go. Tempted to just not link it today, but I'll do it. All right, so when I get started here, we're going to talk about youth and religion again. So we started defining moralistic therapeutic deism last time. Oh, do go away. Talking about this system of religious belief that a lot of millenniums, oh my goodness gracious, Friday. Reading week. Millennials had, sort of implicitly adopted. Not that they use the term, but they'd adopted it, essentially out of, they'd adopted the beliefs. Nobody uses the term, but it's sort of a way of summarizing for Smith and Denton what millennials actually believed. Thank you to those who actually came to class today. I was like, one of these days it's going to happen that no one comes and I lecture to an empty room so I can still do it on YouTube. And that'll be really funny. A snowy day on a Friday at 3 p.m. right before reading week was my best bet for a class where no one at all showed up, but you've exceeded my expectations. All right. As I sip my, once again, purloined Diet Coke, which I once again stole out of my colleague's office. At some point, the box is going to be empty and she's going to get mad, but that day has not yet come. All right, so we ended off on this slide. We're talking about moralistic therapeutic deism. Something is deeply wrong with Slido. I don't think it's going to work with those little bars on it. Oh, there we go. Okay, cool. Don't know what happened there. Right, so we ended off with this slide saying that basically, MTD is about inculcating a moralistic attitude or moralistic approach to life, which is mostly about, people trying to be nice, interpersonally and do your best, not fail to meet your potential. Okay, so the T part. And the T, a lot of people have pointed to, like in the years since Smith and Denton coined the term moralistic therapeutic deism to talk about this sort of way that millennials go about religion. A lot of people have suggested that the T is the most important part of the whole thing because it stands for therapeutic. Okay, so I'll explain this quickly and I'll see if I can give you a little bit of context as to why that might be so important. So what Smith and Denton suggest is that MTD is also about providing therapeutic benefits to adherents, right? And this is a quote. I always forget I need to find the page number and add a page number. This is not me writing anything this smart. This is Smith and Denton, right? So what is MTD? Well, it's not a religion of repentance from sins, right? Or keeping the Sabbath or other holy days, living as a servant of the sovereign divine, of saying your prayers, of fulfilling high holy days, right? None of that stuff. Of building character out of suffering, definitely not, or through suffering. Basking in God's love and grace, not so much. Or spending yourself on the cause of social justice, no. What it actually is centrally about feeling good, happy, secure, and at peace. So whatever MTD does, it's supposed to help you feel good about yourself, right? It's about attaining subjective well-being, being able to resolve problems, and getting along amicably with other people. So if you've ever, I don't know, been in sort of like, especially Christian spaces, and you hear, sermons or messages or whatever that sound a lot like self-help, and it's a lot about be a nice person, here's how prayer can help you solve your problems, or, make your marriage better, you've sort of, or whatever, right? Make your relationships more fulfilling. It's funny. I went to a church not too long ago with a friend of mine, and the pastor was preaching on the book of James, right? And somehow this part of the book of James, which is all about how our desires are evil, ended up becoming this long thing about how we need to communicate better in our marriages. And I just kind of sat back, I closed my eyes, and I was like, oh, we've hit the T of moralistic therapeutic deism. And my friend who had invited me when they're like, well, how was it? I was like, well, kind of therapy, but not, I don't know what religion this is, but it's probably not anything related to Christianity. They didn't really like that. You shouldn't take me places. Don't take a sociologist anywhere. We're overly critical, and we're not always nice about it. Or maybe I'm just a jerk. I clearly never hit the moralistic part. I never quite mastered the don't be interpersonally obnoxious part, especially with my friends. What this is, right, is therapeutic, right? And one of the things that's really notable about this is that increasingly what we see is kind of across religious denominations, right? Like, evangelical Protestantism, I think, is particularly vulnerable to this. But you see it in Catholicism, you see it in Reformed Judaism particularly, or more liberal forms of Judaism. You're starting to see it a little bit even creeping into Islamic dialogues as well. Some of the more liberal ones is a lot of focus on being happy and how the religion, actually, helps you fulfill yourself or feel good, happy, and secure. Not all forms of Islam, but some forms. And what this is the therapeutic part of moralistic therapeutic deism. And it's funny because largely it was predicted that this would happen in a 1966, I guess I could put 1966 book by Philip Rieff called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. And the subtitle of the book is The Uses of Religion After Freud, which makes it a really interesting title. And what Rieff sort of suggests in the book is that, following the 1960s, right, we'd crossed into a world of self-help, and particularly where the focus of people was increasingly on self-fulfillment and happiness, right? And that this was being enabled largely by disciplines like psychology, which focused on therapeutic language, right? And what he said was, in order for religion to survive, religion itself will have to become a form of therapy. And I think this is largely what has happened and what's largely reflected in moralistic therapeutic deism, right? To the extent that people are religious, it is something that helps them feel good about themselves, right? Now again, if you had gone back to, say, the medieval period or even early modernity, and you had suggested that Christianity or any other religion was really about making you feel good about yourself, they would have looked at you a little funny, I think, because that's not generally, I think, one of the messages of most religions is, hey, you just need to be happy. But there you have it. Okay. No questions. So the D part, and the D part, in a sense, is probably the least important of the parts, right? It's moralistic, therapeutic, and deistic. And what Smith and Denton say is it paints a picture of a particular kind of deity, one that is not particularly involved. Sort of like, wound up the clock on the universe, made things, and then steps back and watches things play out. Except, right, so that's classical deism. Deism is a sort of philosophy. You see it a lot, say, like in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century. People like Thomas Jefferson were deists. And basically it says, that, okay, clearly somebody created the world, something created the world, but that being, whatever it is, has largely just departed and is no longer involved in the day-to-day, right? So it's like the clockmaker who winds up the clock and then leaves it to run without much interference. What Smith and Denton suggest is that basically moralistic therapeutic deism has mostly that idea of a deity, one which isn't very involved in the day-to-day, will not care, much about your life, except, they're watching over everything. Mostly that God will only get involved when you call upon them to do so, right? When something goes bad in your life, when something goes wrong, and you then start praying or whatever, call upon this God, and then, like the butler, when you snap your fingers, or the genie when you rub the lamp, God shows up to solve your problems, right? So it sort of it inverts very kind of classical notions of being, say, called by God to do something. In moralistic therapeutic deism, you're not called by God, you call upon God to do things. And I always remember, like when I was in undergrad, one of my good friends, had grown up Catholic, but wasn't particularly involved and had never shown any real interest in religion right up until that day where he thought he'd gotten his girlfriend pregnant. And then, you've never seen anyone pray more fervently for deliverance than my poor friend. As it turned out, she wasn't pregnant. But both of them really thought that she was. And I was like, oh God, I've ruined my life. Please, God, save me. What can I do? I'll do anything. Deals made with God when you think you've gotten your girlfriend pregnant are a thing, I guess. Anyway, this is the kind of vision of God of moralistic therapeutic deism, right? And this point, again, this is right from the book. The God of MTD is not demanding. He can't be, since his job is to solve our problems and make people feel good, right? So if your job is to solve other people's problems, you can't be terribly demanding, right? And of course, this is Buddy Jesus from the movie Dogma with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. Okay. So, last little thing on MTD, I think. Oh, I guess I got two other little things on MTD, and then we'll move on from it and talk a little bit about life outcomes. All right, so we talk about MTD. Again, it's not a religion that teenagers or adults really adopt wholesale. It's not really a religion at all, right? Like I said, Smith and Denton use it as this phrase to kind of summarize what they think the actual belief system of millennials was when they were teenagers. But it's not something like anyone says, I'm a moralistic therapeutic deist, except that one person who took like 3 of my classes and then said, I actually rather like the label, so they started using it. But not recommended. No one will know what you're talking about other than me. So, what does it look like? Well, basically, it's sort of, according to Smith and Denton, right? It operates as a sort of parasite, right? They call it a parasitic faith. Why? Well, because it's pretty thin, right? If we go back to our like 5 kind of beliefs of moralistic therapeutic deism, right? This is pretty thin gruel. There's not a lot there to base your life on, and likely, as a self-sustaining belief system, it would have a really difficult time sort of existing on its own. So what Smith and Denton suggest is that it's sort of, sorry, I know it's not fun when I flash forward and back. It parasitizes other religions, right? Meaning it sort of burrows into them and, essentially over time sort of uses them to propagate itself and transforms them from the inside, right? So it is parasitic. It admixes with elements of more traditional religions, right? So what does it do? And this is a sort of grotesque metaphor, but I like it. It must attach itself to established historical religious traditions, feeding on their doctrines and sensibilities and expanding by mutating their theological substance to resemble its own distinctive image. So what you get out of that is not a kind of new religion, but these, what they call, the misbegotten step cousins of these religions. So you get things like, Christian moralistic therapeutic deism, Jewish moralistic therapeutic deism, Catholic evangelical moralistic therapeutic deism, is Muslim moralistic therapeutic deism, Mormon moralistic therapeutic deism, and even, he says non-religious moralistic therapeutic deism, right? So a lot of your, and if you come take other classes with me, I talked about the nuns last time, actually, I'll say that. The nuns, right, a lot of the nuns would basically fit this mold of a non-religious moralistic therapeutic deist, because a lot of them still believe in God, a lot of them still hold some kind of core religious beliefs, but at the end of the day, you could probably say that they're non-religious moralistic therapeutic deists because their beliefs are largely structured around those 5 kind of points. Okay, and so, to close out, Smith says that, Christianity, much of the Christianity in the United States is only tenuously connected to the actual historical Christian tradition. More so, it has actually been morphed into Christianity's, he calls it the misbegotten step cousin, Christian moralistic therapeutic deism. And I think you could look at, say, a lot of mega churches, churches run by people like Joel Osteen in Houston, and probably what's there is more akin to what Smith would describe as Christian moralistic therapeutic deism. Okay, so one last kind of point on this. So another person who worked on this project, and I mean many, many people worked on it over the 15 years that it was collecting data, was this person, Kenda Cressy-Dean. Kenda Cressy-Dean, she's a professor, or I don't know what she is now. When she wrote this book back in, I think, 2012, she was a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary and a youth minister in the Presbyterian Church. And she did some of the interviews for the project in the state of New Jersey, right? Because she's at Princeton. Princeton is in New Jersey. So she did some of the interviews. And so she got to write on the data that was part of the deal. So what does she say about MTD, right? So she roughly agrees with Smith and Denton about, what the actual beliefs of large parts of the Christian community in the U.S. are. It's moralistic therapeutic deism, not really Christianity in any recognizable sense. But what she says is that if we look at this, almost from a functionalist perspective, MTD exists for a reason, right? And specifically, that has to do with the changes to American society. And I think you could say Canadian society as well, particularly around things like pluralism, right? So pluralism is when you have lots of different people with lots of different beliefs. So what does moralistic therapeutic deism do? Well, okay, it's useful in one sense because basically it helps, religion, right, Christianity in particular, sort of stay afloat by turning it into one other tool in people's therapeutic toolkit, right? By equipping them to be happy enough, right? Giving them another thing that's supposed to, essentially make them happy. So far, so good. The other thing is it sort of, turns God into a tool, right? So it may, it approaches God instrumentally, which is fancy, academic language for meaning that God becomes just another tool in people's toolkit of achieving the things that they want in life. So it empowers them, to do good and feel good. And I think this is probably the key line from Dean, and something, we should remember. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted my highlighter. So it makes sense in a pluralistic culture. And why? Well, she tells a really interesting anecdote in the book, and it's, of the book, it's probably the thing that stuck with me the most, is she talks about, driving her daughter to soccer practice. And one of her daughter's friends is Hindu, right? And so basically her daughter and her daughter's friend are sitting in the backseat of the car on the way to soccer practice, and they have this conversation, which is basically them comparing their religions, right? And, Presbyterian, it's a very classical form of Protestantism, and Hindu, But what these two girls sort of decide is that, well, at the end of the day, they basically believe the same things, which is a little funny because there could probably be, there are certainly similarities between Christianity and Hinduism. There's just not that many, right? They believe very different things about the order of the universe, about the purpose of human beings, about human value, all sorts of things, right? About whether, gods exist, the nature of the universe, and all of this other stuff. But they come to this, understanding. They believe the same things, and so they basically don't have to talk about it anymore. And why that makes sense, and why, it's always kind of stuck with me, and it stuck with Dean at the time too, as she, put forward that anecdote, is it allows you in a pluralistic consumer culture to sort of get by without some of the messier parts of religion, specifically the need to spread your religion to other people, right? What Christians would call evangelization, whatever it's called in other religions, it's basically the same thing, which is, converting people to your religion. Now, in societies where most people believed the same things, it's not really a concern, right? If all of your friends were Catholic because you lived in a Catholic country and all your neighbors are Catholic, you don't have to worry about converting anybody, right? If, you live in like Canada prior to really the 1970s, right? You live in a country that's largely dominated by Protestants and Catholics. You stay on your side, I stay on my side. We don't need to worry about each other. But if we do meet, we might have to try to convert each other, right? And if we, awkward things will happen, like, a Catholic and a Protestant getting married and they can't be buried in the same cemetery. Things like that. However, as we get even more diverse societies, right, you're going to know more and more people of more and more different religions, no religion at all, and all of these sorts of things. And it is a huge drag to try and convert all your friends all the time, right? You're not going to have that many friends because it's not that interesting a thing to do, right? If you are like, hey, I'd like to invite you for coffee, and you're like, great. And you sit down and they're like, have you heard about the message of Jesus? And you're like, yes, the 26 times we've had this conversation, I have in fact heard about the message of Jesus. Could we just talk about like celebrity gossip or some shit, right? It gets annoying, right? And it's difficult in a pluralistic society because you suddenly don't have that social cohesion. So what MTD does, right, and where I said it was syncretistic, right, and it comes to this conclusion that basically, I don't know if I can go, I'm going to go back. Where is it, right? That this moral vision is inclusive of most religions, which are presumed to ultimately stand for the equivalent moral values. Well, then you don't have to convert your friends, right? Because even if they're Hindus, they're basically good people. I'm not saying Hindus aren't good people. I was just using that as an example, right? Even if they're Catholic, they're still good people, and you all basically believe the same thing, so let's just leave it at that. Okay, so, and this is my favorite phrase, and I wish I could turn a phrase like this. I'll be honest, I'm not, when it comes to my writing, I'm a good and clear writer. I'm not a pithy one, and this is pithy writing. It's a quote from the book: social survival requires turning down the heat on Jesus. And I don't know why I love that phrase. It just like always makes me laugh a little bit. Haha. And other confessional particularities. And what do? You highlight personal and communal benefits that make anxious people feel safe and valued. So religion's all about community, right? And making yourself feel safe and happy, and you don't feel the need to convert people because you have turned down, the heat on Jesus or Muhammad or whoever, right? You don't need to kind of focus on that. Okay. I love that God is a tool is all anyone got out of what I just said. Cool. I will, at some point, answer this question. Okay. Yes. Now, charts meet life. I'm going to talk a little bit about life outcomes. Because one of the other interesting things that sort of comes out of the National Study of Youth and Religion, and they do this in a couple of ways, and I'll show you some data from the first two waves of the study. So the one that happened when these young people were teenagers, and the one that happens as they're sort of exiting college and entering that emerging adult kind of phase. But they looked at life outcomes. And the question that Smith and Denton asked first, and then that Smith and Patricia Snell will ask later on in the follow-up book, Souls in Transition, is this, right? Are religious youth any different from non-religious youth, right? Is there actual benefit or detriment potentially to religion, right? Is faith actually consequential in the lives of American teenagers? And what they say in their kind of summary is that although many teenagers can't see it, according to the findings of the National Study of Youth and Religion, the difference between more and less religious teens in the United States are significant and consistent across, not some, not most, across every, I should really have a better highlighter color, every outcome measured. And that bolding is mine, not theirs. Okay. So, what are they measuring in terms of life outcomes, risk behavior, quality of family and adult relationships, moral reasoning and behavior, community participation, media consumption, sexual activity, and emotional well-being? And all of this, of course, they do with all the fancy schmancy, statistical wizardry of really good sociologists. So they weight the data, right? They control for 7 key demographic factors like gender, right? Because they had more girls in their sample than boys. So they had to re-weight some of it. Not all of the ages kind of lined up with kind of population, race, region, parental marital status. Region of residence is important because the South is quite a bit more religious than the North. Parental education and family income, right? So they re-weighted a lot of the data, with all of those doodads. Okay, do I go through the categories? I'll answer that later. I want to move through this quickly. Okay. So, yeah, when they talk about the different levels, so there's different levels of religiosity when they talk about in the study. They basically classed young people into 4 categories. The devoted, is it the regulars? Oh, I forget. Oh, the regulars, the sporadics, and the disengaged, right? Sorry, I'm going to stop flicking around slides like a person with severe ADHD as soon as I no longer feel like I have severe ADHD. The different levels of American religious culture, they determined by looking at a whole bunch of things, right? Beliefs, practices, experiences, affiliation, and group participation, right? So it's largely behavioral. And one thing to say about it, and I think I have this on another slide a little further on, when you looked at individual religious groups, right? Let's say you took, say, Catholics. There really is no benefit to being Catholic, broadly, right? Catholics themselves are super diverse. There's very religious Catholics, and there's essentially irreligious Catholics, right? Same thing if you looked at Jews, evangelicals, mainline Protestants, Muslims, any religious group, there's going to be more and less religious participants. So what they did instead was group them by kind of the intensity of their religious beliefs, practices, experiences, affiliation, and group participation into these 4 categories. Okay, that should be later. Okay, I don't know why that slide is there. It got moved accidentally. So, they class them into these 4 categories. The smallest one being the devoted. I think in the first wave, it's about 8% of young people fit into that category. And then regular sporadics and the disengaged. Now, when they talk about risk behaviors, right? Generally, we think of risk behaviors as bad, right? They're not generally things that lead to good life outcomes. So the fewer that are manifest within a young person or a group of young people, the better typically their life outcomes are going to be. And what do we see in general, in all these categories? We see that the devoted tend to score the lowest in terms of risk behavior of any category, right? So those who are most religiously devoted, for example, they drink, weekly or more. There's no people in the sample that said that, so 0. Compared to, 4% of their regularly attending peers, 7% of the sporadics, and 11% of the disengaged, right? They don't get drunk very much, and like the average for all US teens is 5%. Smoking cigarettes, right? Again, this is the early 2000s, so vaping wasn't a thing yet. Again, you see basically the disengaged at twice the national average and 13% higher than the most religious. And that kind of structure follows you all the way through this, right? Smoking marijuana, don't smoke marijuana. It's really, really bad for you. It's bad for your brain. Once you're 25, smoke as much of it as you want, probably. But when your brain's still developing and it stops developing about 24, 25, don't smoke weed. And what do we see? Well, our most religiously devoted people generally smoke a lot less of it than, their less devoted peers. Okay, same thing for cutting classes, right? They're the least likely to cut classes 6 times or more, 10% less likely than the disengaged, and much more likely to say they've never skipped classes, 76 versus 48%. They get fewer C's, D's, and F's, quite a bit less, 11% less than are disengaged. They don't get expelled. Their parents report that they are fairly or very rebellious only 3% of the time, and you see all the other ones, right, are double digits, and our least engaged are at 17, and they have a bad temper. Okay, teenagers have bad tempers, right? 32 versus 49%. Okay, I'm going to try to go through these quickly because I know you don't want me to just read charts all day, and I think we make the point clearly. Again, if we look at body image and self-worth, more of them say they're very happy with their physical body and physical appearance, over half, versus less than a third at the other end. And the other two categories are somewhere in the middle, right, but still less good than our most devoted. Do they feel sad or depressed usually or always? Well, 4 times less likely to say that than the religiously disengaged, and some percentages, less than the other categories. More likely to say never, though not by huge margins, than the other categories as well. They're less likely to feel alone and misunderstood a lot, and more likely to say by 20 points that they never feel that way. They're less likely, than the disengaged, but the same as the other two categories, to say they never or they feel invisible a lot, so they're less likely, and much more likely to say never than any of our other categories, right? They feel cared about more by quite a bit, right? Here we're talking almost a 20-point spread between these two numbers, right? So, they feel cared about by responsible people a lot, 92%. Okay, pretty good. Feel guilty about things. You would think religious people, especially Catholics and Jews, would feel guilty about stuff all the time, but less so than their less religiously engaged peers. Think about plans for the future, considerably more, right? And they're actually bringing up the average. They bring it up to 75, whereas all the other groups are below. Think about the meaning of life more, and feel life is meaningless less by a considerable margin, right? Over half of them say they never feel it, versus less than a third for the disengaged. I mean, again, I have to highlight some things on this chart. I should probably have kept my powder dry. Okay, the relationships with adults. What is interesting here? Okay, so let's just go through the numbers here. I'll do it in some detail because it matters to the question of why. So 52% of US teens said that they were fairly or very comfortable talking to adults other than their parents, right? Dang it. It's 6-7. 67% right there. 6-7. So they are much higher than the average. And the only two groups that are above the US average are the devoted and the regulars. The other two groups are slightly below the average, right? And the devoted are way high. Now, here's where I think the magic really happens. So, number of adults a teen can turn to for support, advice, and help, not including their parents. 8.4 for the devoted. They just have more adults in their life they feel like they can turn to for help, right? whether that be pastors, teachers, coaches, other people in their communities, whatever it happens to be. And they are way above the US average of 5.7. In fact, they're the only group above that average, right? So they are bringing that average up. The number, this one also important, the number of supportive adults, the teens' parents know well enough to talk to. So, if there's something going on with little Tommy or little Gina, adults are going to notice if those adults are talking to each other. That's good because those problems tend to get spotted and sorted out. And you see this number, 7.3 for the devoted. Their parents know 7.3 other adults well enough to talk to you about their kids, right? And the only group at the average other than them is the regulars. The other two are well below, right? Many fewer adults keeping an eye on these kids. And, these two categories, they tend to spend less time unsupervised. It's not a huge amount, 0.8 days less, or 0.8 afternoons less without adult supervision. And, 0.6 less evenings unsupervised. But if you remember with Gen Z, I told you one of the reasons that Gen Z had sex early and often is because their parents left them alone and they invited their significant others over after school and, things ended up in the bedroom and teen pregnancies ensued. Huzzah. Less likely for that to happen because they're spending a little bit less time unsupervised. Okay, and moral reasoning behavior. I'll come back to that slide over and over again probably. Moral reasoning behavior, right? More likely to believe that, less likely to believe that morals are relative, right? A lot less than their disengaged peers, but even, compared to these two categories, still quite a bit less, right? So they tend to think that morals are quite objective. If you remember the millennials, right? It's a very unusual attitude amongst millennials. Millennials are moral consequentialists, which means there are no moral norms, right? If they're unsure about what's right and wrong, they would do what, would help them get ahead. It's 1% for them. There's a 15% spread with the disengaged, and still an 11 and 12% spread with the other two categories. Okay, if unsure about what's right and wrong in a situation, they would do what makes them feel happy, right? 6% versus 40, right? That's a 34% spread. So they're less likely to just do what's going to make them feel happy. They're going to do something else, right? They're going to do probably what they think is right. So a big spread between the devoted and other kind of categories. And they lie to their parents less, cheat on tests and assignments a little bit less, more likely to say never by a 12-point spread. They didn't use AI on their exams because there is no AI back then. Did things they hoped their parents wouldn't find out about, again, considerably less by a 15-point spread, than these ones. And still by like a, 10-point spread here and an 8-point spread there. So different kind of moral and reasoning behavior. Now, all of this does play out in interesting ways socially, right? Teens that are like this are the ones that are likely to engender the trust of adults around them, right? Because they have certain moral qualities that make them seem upstanding, right? That make them seem like they are trustworthy. And so, it's a form of kind of cultural capital. They're able to leverage that into adult trust in a lot of ways. Oh God, this slide. Okay. Every year I tell myself, split this slide into 2 slides. But this slide is going to take a while. We're going to finish the class off today talking about this slide, and we're going to come back to it on the Monday after reading week because it's a long one. Okay, so why are those most religious youth different than other people, and why do they tend to have better life outcomes as teenagers? And as we'll see, right, once we get through this slide, those carry through into young adulthood as well, right? The number of the devoted gets smaller. That group actually gets smaller. All the other groups get bigger. But those kind of better life outcomes continue into emerging adulthood. And Smith and Denton say that they think this is down to what they call 9 cultural factors. Now, some of these have to do with religion and some of them don't, right? And what I'll say about this, and what I've sort of come to believe about these 9 cultural factors, and it's entirely possible because I do this every year. I've spent more time thinking about this than Smith and Denton ever did in terms of these 9 cultural factors. But I'm sort of convinced that we've got like a couple that are sort of explicitly religious, right? These number 1 and 2. And number 5 I put as a maybe religious, maybe not, and I'll explain why. So only 3 of these are really religious, I think, at most. The rest of them are largely down to community, right? They are largely down, I think, to the quality of young people's community life, right? And one of the things that I think is really important to stress with these 9 cultural factors is those devoted youth, right? What is the thing that really makes them different than their regular, sporadic, and disengaged peers? Is that they spend more time in communities, right? Because religion is one of those funny things, right? It sort of forces you, for the most part, to show up somewhere and do some stuff with people who are mostly like-minded, but not always, right? Even as we see this shift, right, which I've described before in the class. I talked about, Robert Putnam's thesis in Bowling Alone, that one of the things that happens, after we get cable TV in America is a kind of slow and steady degradation of community life, right? Prior to cable TV, your house is really boring. Once you get cable TV, your house is really, really, really fun. And so you tend to stay there more. And so what happens is young people spend less and less time out in the world, whether that's playing soccer, whether it's working, whether it's dating, whether it's attending religious services. There's just a lot less of it. Now, this one, I'm gonna make an argument here that I think is pretty uncontroversial, and you can find it in things like Robert Nesbitt's The Quest for Community. Communities are good for us, right? They are good. Being in communities is kind of the normal state of human beings, and good things happen when you're interacting with other human beings in meaningful ways, right? You learn about yourself, people invest in you, you grow as a person, you make strong connections and friendships, and all of these great things. And so how the devoted are different is largely down to a couple of things, many of which simply have to do with the fact that they are still in communities and they're there regularly. And those communities, amongst other things, are age mixed, so they're mixing with older and younger people. And I'll describe some of the things here, when we talk about things like community and leadership skills, right? They're involved in those communities in really meaningful ways. And that is a lot of what leads them to relatively positive life outcomes, right? So, my kind of conviction here, lest I be accused of anything, is that it doesn't really matter. I'm going to write it. It does not matter what religion it is. Right? It's not like, and the data from Smith and Denton and everything else I've ever seen suggests that it doesn't matter if you're talking about Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism's a little funny because involvement in communities is a little different. But if there's involvement in Buddhist communities, right, whatever it happens to be, it doesn't matter what religion it is, it's the community aspects that are really good for people, right? And seem to lead to those better life outcomes. That's my preamble. I haven't even finished the preamble on this slide. That's the preamble. I have 2 minutes left. That took like 10 minutes on its own. I love this slide, but I also hate this slide. I could change this slide, but me and this slide now have a like 8-year relationship. So, it's hard to turn your back on it. I try to change it, but can you really change someone you love? All right, let's do the first one. Actually, 49 on that clock. Let's just leave this here. I can't do this in 1 minute. I can't do that to you, beautiful. I'm talking to the slide. So we're going to leave this. We'll pick it up on Monday. We're going to start from our 9 cultural factors, and that might be all we get done on Monday. Who knows? No, it'll probably take about 10, 15 minutes, and we'll get through this. And we'll have a great reading week. We'll see you when everyone gets back. Try to get some rest. Don't work too hard. Do at least one thing that feels, relaxing. Don't just write papers and study. Okay, we'll see you after the break. Lots of questions. Hello.
I just wanted to make sure the email that didn't hear after I did it.
I just sent it to you like 10 minutes before class. I was like, I've just been having trouble finding the time to it took me like an hour. There's 4 questions. It took me like an hour to write out the answers. So it took me a spell. Yeah. So, all right. And if somehow it didn't come through, let me know.
No, I just don't have Wi-Fi down here, at all.
Oh, really?
No, not on my phone, not on it.
Any questions, do let me know. And yeah. You as well. Oh, I need it so bad. You as well.